In this video, I just wanted to run through the font material, which is for widgets. So you can see here under font, I have got my UI matte WA. And if we look at that material, first things first. So the one thing that you need to do is change your material domain to user interface here. It's normally on surface, so come down to user interface. That then truncates your output node, and you've got less options. You can't kind of take through things like metallicity and normal maps, for example. Now, the first thing is to note that you can use a Vertex color node so that your material in the designer honors any of the color changes. And that's why we've used a Vertex color node. Now, if I had inadvertently used a color instead, so that's our material here, but then any alteration in here, it becomes additive. So I'm now adding that color. So I'm not going to get the results that I might expect if I've set the color here. So just keep Vertex color node instead. So if I'm using a texture, there's a few things to bear in mind. By default, if I don't add a UV, it will just be the texture coordinate with a 0 coordinate index, and it will just stretch that material to fit each of the lines of text. So you can see as the text goes up and re-wraps up, it's that single texture getting stretched across that full width. If I come back and plug in a texture coordinate with a coordinate index of 1, this is a special coordinate index for font material. So if I apply that, your preview will look a little strange, but now that is being applied to each of the letters. Let me just come back 1 second because there's no values in here. It's 0.2. That's a bit of a hangover. Let me put it to 1. So it gives us the results we expect here in our preview. But then when we come back to material, it's now on an individual character basis. Now, the one thing to bear in mind is that it's still being stretched because each of the letters is a slightly different proportion. So we can see here on the L that it's actually the UV for the letter is a different shape to the other characters. Now, this is something that I need a little bit of help with. So if anybody knows how to fix this, that would be really, really helpful. I've been playing around a little and I'll show you what I've been up to. A kind of workaround, which isn't quite what I had wanted, was to use the screen aligned pixel to pixel UV node, which is a material function that's just built in. If I plug that in, let me just drag that down, plug that into our material, apply it and save. Now this is rather nice, and again, like with any of these things, you've got to kind of think about how that effect is useful. So the screen aligned pixel to pixel UVs is a kind of two-dimensional equivalent to the world-aligned texture. And, you know, I can obviously change the size of my texture. Let's keep it to the power of 2 and apply that. And now I've got a much tighter material. But as that's moving, the material is actually static and we're really masking through the type. But the material doesn't move along with the text, and now that's what I'm trying to work out, and I haven't managed to do that without using this technique. I don't want the UVs to stretch on an individual character basis, so there's a little bit of back and forth. Now, as an aside, there is quite a lot of fun to be had also using the screen position pin here on this material. Plug that in. Now, what have we got going on here? So This is the result of a fair amount of trial and error and just playing around. So follow this structure and play with the values. So let's have a look at the effect of this code here on our widget. So you can now see that, let me increase it to make it a little bit more dramatic. That multiplier 100. And now we're affecting the individual points of the font. So that's obviously a little bit excessive. But what's interesting is that it's taking those values from this texture, which I've got a panner on. And of course I can affect the speed, so I can kind of make things a little bit manic. And you're then kind of adding other animation to what is in effect live text. So, this can be updated from a variable. I'm being a little bit dramatic for effect, but you can do some really very lovely things with this. Let me pull some of these values back down, and through a bit of trial and error and just trying out a few different textures, you can get some really interesting effects. So obviously this is quite tonal, but for example, if you use something, I think it was this one. So now, because we've got blocks of color rather than tones, it's actually snapping to those points, which is a very different effect. So it's the texture that's driving that animation. Which I think is hilarious. Again, you have to sort of use these things sparingly, or in the appropriate place, or to kind of fulfill some creative ambition. It's quite nuts. I like it. Now, another thing that I noted, that idea of having a texture that you can pull out across the whole screen space could also be used to great effect. So let me just work out what I had done. So another node that I had a little bit of play around with was the screen aligned UVs, which if you just plug in the X 100%, Y 100%, then you'll note that now, rather than it being per line or per character, it's across the whole viewport. Now, obviously this texture isn't particularly exciting, just using the X, but again, you could use this to great creative effect if you wanted to have some variations of color as people move around the screen. So I just did a quick crude test with something from the starter content. Let me just find that gradient. Come on, please. Here. And it's a bit saturated, but let me show you what I mean. Let's say if I come here and now look, so you'll see that it's blue and yellow. It gets bluer over here. There's a gradient on the text. As I'm coming to the right, it's redder. So, it's just adding a sort of layer of interest, but all through a screen aligned texture that is taking up the whole of the viewport. And we're effectively masking through that type. So I thought that was rather nice. Again, it could be used in a slightly more subtle way, depending on your scenario. So, combining some of these effects together, you get some quite interesting results. As you can see, I've changed my screen position texture once again. And let me just launch what this does now. So, it's just a bit silly, but you get the idea. So now I'm masking through that type to reveal the color texture, but then got that screen position offset happening to each of the vertices on the font as well. So techniques like this really need crafting, so excuse my slightly crude example, but it's a lot of fun, definitely. So this is kind of what I got to after just trying to work something out with regard to not stretching a texture on the font. The problem being, I've still not worked out what I'd originally set out to do and have gone down a rabbit hole instead. And that certainly won't be the last time that happens. Obviously, if that widget wasn't moving, I wouldn't have the problem. The thing that I started to do was track the mouse position, which I was writing to a material parameter collection, the X and Y, and then dividing that against the screen resolution to try and offset my texture coordinate, which in principle kind of corrects the screen position of the texture, but the problem is the UVs of each of the characters being stretched in different proportions. That's the inherent problem. So if anybody knows how to fix that, or a way of hacking the screen aligned node so that it honors any offset, then please do comment below or ask any questions about any of what I've shown you today. Many thanks. So I hope that video is of use. If so, please do like and subscribe and hit the notification bell to receive any updates. And thank you for your support.